All right, everyone. I know we all have a busy afternoon. We just need those folders handed out. Very good. Thank you.
They ain't got the bills in them. We'll have to bring those
They don't
out
have the
individually.
bills. All right. So we'll come back to order if our committee members could go ahead and have a seat. We will go ahead and get back to order here. All right. Do we have House Bill 551 ready to be handed out? Great. Can we go ahead and do that, please? Thank you. All right, very good. Representative Hill, if you want to come on up to the podium, we'll go ahead and get you first. All right, thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and come back to order. I know that we have a quorum. It's just some of our members stepped out for a little break between the meetings, so we'll have everyone back in here before we take action. But at this point in time, I'll call House Bill 551, LC 289316S. Representative Hill is present. Representative, would you like to provide us a testimony about your bill, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After a 9-month study along with the Senate and also inviting different members of our community and law officials and anyone who might be interested or tied to the study of kratom, K-R-A-T-O-M. This is what we have come to, and here is the substitute that we have been working off of, and that relating to controlled substances, so to provide a definition, to provide prohibition of access to kratom persons under 18 years of age, and to provide for package labeling requirements, and to provide for a penalty, to provide for related matters, to repeal conflicting laws, and for other purposes. And that's pretty much what we've attempted to do here, is to get some kind of control on the packaging and also the sales of kratom, which right now there is no control. The FDA does not watch it. And it's becoming an issue in some cases, but we don't know if it's actually true kratom or if it's adulterated kratom. And so with our study, we came up with these suggestions, and that's why we're presenting House Bill 551 to address those matters and concerns.
Well, thank you, Representative Hill, for your presentation. Just for the committee members' benefit, if any of them aren't aware, there was a study committee that you had, a House study committee that you chaired last year with 3 meetings about this issue. Is that correct?
That's correct, along with the Senate as well. Chairman Mullis on that, he chaired that side. We did it jointly, so we could kind of wrap it up pretty quick because our days got fewer and fewer as we went along.
Okay. The Reeves subcommittee reviewed this bill, and I know that we had 2 subcommittee hearings at least about this bill. Is that right?
That's true, okay. Yes.
And I know that in cooperation with the Prosecuting Attorney's Council and the Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Attorneys, this substitute was prepared today. Is that right?
That's true, yes.
Okay. As well as, I believe, input from the GBI and others?
Yes, we've had input from the GBI as well as the kratom industry, and everybody's in agreement. It's a nonpartisan. Everybody's in agreement to this to achieve some type of regulations and control of knowing what is in the packages that's available at our local convenience stores as well as Walmart, and they can also buy it online.
Well, since Vice Chairman Reeves is not here, maybe I can attempt to summarize what I expect would be the subcommittee report, and that is, after really trying to gain information about this substance, it appears under current law there is no restriction to providing it even to children. There's no restrictions with respect to the labeling, and it is a double negative, but it's not illegal under federal law as well. And so it's really an unregulated substance, and the legislation as presented here would provide some regulation in place. And in the view of the subcommittee, that is a step in the right direction. Of course, as science and the FDA continues to evaluate this in the future, there might be further steps that would need to be taken, but at least right now, something is being done. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's a good sum of what we're trying to accomplish, and I appreciate that. Thank you, sir.
Are there any questions for the sponsor? All right, seeing none, thank you, sir. All right, we generally hear all testimony in subcommittee, but I'm happy to just check the room right now. Is anyone here about House Bill 551 or wishing to speak on House Bill 551? Okay, I don't see any hands raised. So at this point in time, I'd be happy to entertain a motion.
Make a motion to pass.
All right, there's a motion to pass on LC 289316S. Is there a second? All right, there's a second. Any amendments, discussion, or debate? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, it passes unanimously. Representative Hill, it's under rules. Thank you. All right, very good. The next bill that I'll call is Representative Ballinger's House Bill 260. Representative Ballinger, you're welcome to stay where you are or go to the podium. Can we get that handed out to the members? It is. Is it? Great. I guess I was the only one missing a copy. I'll steal Matt's. So. All right. So we're looking at LC 480106S. Is that correct? All right. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, it's my pleasure to bring before you House Bill 260. After being heard in subcommittee and getting all the feedback from Prosecuting Attorneys Council, members of the committee, and others, we settled on some consensus language, which makes it an offense of second-degree burglary if he or she enters or remains within an occupied dwelling of another and commits an act of simple battery in violation of subsection C or F of Code Section 16523, just to specify that specifically pregnant, elderly, or family violence, incidents of family violence, or a battery, and it's any battery. And I'll be more than happy to entertain any questions you may have.
All right. Are there any questions for the sponsor? All right. Seeing none, is there anyone? Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll just open this up as well. Is there any input from the audience? I don't see any hands raised. Well, this bill did come through Chairman Setzler's subcommittee. And I see he's stepped aside. Maybe I can just summarize. We had at least 2 subcommittee meetings, maybe 3, on this bill, and there was discussion about maybe even expanding the scope from that which was originally written as far as the criminal conduct captured. But it was a determination subcommittee that the most appropriate place for this would be in burglary second degree. I think that's a summary of the deliberation that took place. All right, so in light of that, is there, do we have do we have a motion? All right, motion do pass House Bill 260, which is LC 480106S, committee substitute. Is there a second? All right, there's a motion and second. Any amendments, debate, discussion, questions? All right, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, it's on to rules. Thank you. All right, you might not be able to leave. Let me count. You have somewhere to be. Maybe some of our members stepped out, so before we vote, we'll make sure they're in. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right, thank you very much. All right, so the next bill we'll call is House Bill 43, which we have the substitute in our folders, LC 289317 ERS. And I will ask if our staff could just step out and grab, oh, here he is, Chairman Setzler, if you'd like to present your bill either from the podium or the seat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the
indulgence of the committee to hear HB 43. We're working off of LC version 289317 ERS. And I was out talking to PAC. I know there's been a substitute that was pulled together that took some policy consensus issues that we had agreed to. And as I present this, there will be one thing I'll raise to the committee as I think it'll be a very easy language change. But that being said, HB 43 again addresses the issue of unlawful sexual contact between people in special settings, be they schools, be they hospitals, be they a confinement circumstance where law enforcement has people under custody, be it under professional counseling, or be it under probation or supervision, accountability court circumstance. What this does is it recognizes that in the school setting in particular, the definition under existing law is limited to people with supervisory or disciplinary responsibility, and it's further limited to teacher or principal. Paraprofessionals, other coaches, community coaches, other people who have an agency authority within the school are not covered at all. So as it stands today, paraprofessionals are legally allowed to have, who are working in schools, operate with the authority of the school in the school setting, are able to have sex with 16 and 17-year-old kids in the school setting, or that they encounter in their particular school setting without breaking the law. That's one of the things this seeks to address. As it does that, as it broadens the definition of people who are now legally prohibited for sexual contact of any kind, it does create a two-tier system where sexually explicit contact, intercourse, and the like is a first degree, and then touching generally outside the clothing would be a second degree. It treats it with less severity with respect to punishment. That's what the bill does, Mr. Chairman. We've worked on this, and I appreciate the committee's indulgence to hear it again today.
Thank you. You mentioned one possible amendment that's needed. Would you detail that?
I will want to recognize somebody, perhaps to speak to a language change in the sub that I saw this morning for the first time. So if it pleases the chair, I'd like to recognize Ms. Travis to speak to this. She was involved in some of the drafting of it. So,
yeah, thank you. I see no questions for the sponsor, so thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And Ms. Travis, if you'd be willing to come up to the podium.
Can I grab from here? Or do you
I don't know that we're being recorded, so I think we need you to be close to the microphone. Thank you.
make sure I'm answering the question that you have? The question was with regard to the language of adding the words in self-employed. You'll see that on several lines, especially on page 3. And the bill is presented is dealing with employees and agents, but there are going to be circumstances where people are self-employed. They're homeschool teacher would be self-employed, psychiatrist might be self-employed, and the concept is in terms of what the chairman was mentioning yesterday is you're making this a class offense, so you need to keep the class as to whether it's an employee, an agent, or whether they work for themselves. You're still saying the behavior is prohibited. The self-employed language isn't used in law enforcement, for example. It's not used in correctional facilities because you're not going to be self-employed in that situation. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'll recognize Representative Setzler.
Hey, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. I think the objective here is, so the answer is maybe. I think the objective here is someone that's an employee or acting in any form of employment or volunteerism or contract status that has the effect of being given formal authority to act, not simple volunteer that they're working for as a, again, as a bake sale volunteer, but acting with some level of authority in any manner of employment positioning, should be under the definition of agent. I'm not, again, that maybe it's a different way to structure it. My expectation, though, is an agency authority or an agency relationship contemplates no compensation, contemplates being a contractor who's operating in a setting. So perhaps this gets at the underlying definition of agent more than it does to add another thing. I think a self-employed person operating in a school, if they don't have an agency capacity, are they now caught up in this? just because I'm a self-employed person who showed up at the school to make a delivery or something. I think to me, the agency authority and the line, in fact, the chair recalls, as do many members of this committee, the reason we chose agency was to be clear that there was, in fact, even defined agency on line 22, individual authorized to act on behalf of. There's a formal authorization to establish the agency, not just in service to, or an outsider coming in. I don't think a FedEx delivery person, for example, that shows up, that's a self-employed FedEx delivery person, they lease their truck, they make package deliveries every Monday or every day at 10 o'clock to a high school. I don't think the fact that they're operating as a contractor in a high school, they show up every day with deliveries, self-employed. If they have a sexual relationship with a student in that high school that's in the same apartment complex with them, I think their presence at a high school every day between 10 and 10:15 shouldn't make them a felon because they're a self-employed person that has some relationship with the school. I think there has to be an agency relationship within the school that really establishes that. That was really the thinking of this, was trying to be as tight as we could be.
So you see no issue with the substitute as presented?
Mr. Chairman, no, I do have an issue with the addition of or self-employed.
Okay.
I think we had it, I think the policy changes that the solicitors brought with respect to a second offense being a 1 to 5 felony for second degree, I have no issue with that. I just think that and I wasn't part of the conversation, there was some cleanup efforts here. I can be convinced, but I don't know that this is a better approach to this. I think it creates more uncertainty. And I know that there may be a policy interest to again, this sense of, this bill's all about casting the net broader. I think the reason we've been working on this for as long as we have, we're trying to cast this net just right. That's my goal. Not too broad, not too narrow.
So we're looking at line 58. See it there.
And I'm glad to hear, I mean, I'm not being argumentative. I'm glad to hear some feedback. I appreciate the ladies' experience and input.
Line 92.
Well, the definition of agent is acting on behalf of another.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that the FedEx, the FedEx person is acting on behalf of FedEx.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think they would be acting on behalf of the school in that scenario.
So what I'd ask us to do just briefly is let's just identify the lines at issue and maybe have a better understanding. And then if we need to have discussion, we'll just do it with either the author can testify or the committee members can ask questions to you, Ms. Travis, or to other witnesses that are here.
Yeah, and I think I'm just helping with the language. But
Understood.
the prosecution is the one that's going to have to prove the case. So
That's a very good point. Yes, ma'am.
They might be in a better position to argue with you why they would like to see it kept.
Right. And Mr. Chairman, my point is,
Well, again, let's just go through, let's identify the lines at issue first, and then we will we'll have that discussion. So line 65, line 92, line 97, 98, 100, all right, thank you, 110. Does that capture all of the references?
Line 239 doesn't say self-employed, it says employer agent.
yeah. That's actually the name of the offense.
That's the name of the offense, yeah.
No, we're not changing. Mr. Chairman, the thinking is, if there's a person that, appropriate time, if there's a person that's self-employed, that has authority that is consistent with the term agent, I think agent covers them. I don't know that there's a need to state it separately. So if an individual who's self-employed is an agent and they have an agency responsibility, I think the bill covers them without that language. If they're a self-employed individual who doesn't have an agency authority, then I think this bill specifically intends to exclude them because they don't have an agency authority. Yeah.
Mr. Travis, I think we've heard that you disagree with the drafting. Is there anything else that you want to add about that?
I don't disagree with the drafting. I'm trying to explain why we included self-employed.
I see. Okay.
And then, otherwise, no, I don't have anything else to add. But in terms of why you may also want to include the self-employed, maybe you could
Of
hear
course,
from PAC.
that's
Okay.
the direction we're headed. Thank
May
you.
I step
There-
away?
There is a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay.
Representative Kendrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I know agency can both be actual and implied. Under the situation with the FedEx person coming to the school, is the argument that there is an implied agency because they are coming to the school making those deliveries? I'm trying to understand the argument from.
Mr. Chair, this is, to the lady's point, it's probably a really bad example I came up with. Operating completely on the fly, unprepared to address this at all until 10 minutes ago. FedEx people showing up at a school sprung to mind immediately. But I think it's no more or no less thoughtful than that. I think the issue is we're creating a circumstance where someone who is of the age to consent can have consensual sex with someone. We're making a felony offense because of the status of the actor. And if the actor doesn't have, they're not an employee with specific responsibilities for compensation, or if they don't have a clear agency responsibility, why would we make it a felony offense in a hospital setting for consensual, for adults? I mean, the person, a 35-year-old man that's rolling in a bed, that's rolling in a lunch, for a person that's in hospital for a knee operation, and say it's a 36-year-old woman that's having her knee operation, if they decide to have consensual sexual contact, that she initiates. If he touches her, he's committing a crime now. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. That there's got to be a circumstance in which the individual who's an actor has a direct agency responsibility. That's got to be a pretty tight definition because of what we're doing and how this operates. So I think if they don't have that agency, and to your point, implied agency or specified agency, I believe agency is the kind of thing that courts and juries can sort out. I think we need to, at the chairman's behest, we did define it here, but it needs to be somebody acting on behalf of another that's clearly acting on their behalf, not just I decided to step up on my own and do this in furtherance of someone else's mission, a good Samaritan. I'm not talking about that at all. It really is somebody that's authorized to do so.
So my follow-up to that, I'm with you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I just brought that up because it seems like if we add the word actual agency as opposed to implied agency, then it covers what you're talking about, where you don't have somebody who acting on their behalf just sort of comes up and creates like an implied agency relationship. It actually has to be an actual agency relationship, and then you don't have to add the self-employed language.
I appreciate the lady's question on line 22. That's why authorized to act. Not acting in furtherance of, not acting on behalf of, but authorized to. If there's not a formal authorization, that agency doesn't really stick. No agency attaches to that person, as it were, to find a term, unless it's given. You know, a person that likes to hang out at the football field every day and watch the team practice is not an agent of the school. When they're given a key card and they're named a community coach and they're on the school website and they pass a criminal background check to make sure they can be around kids, then they have an agency. But me going to practice every day doesn't give me that. And I think there's a distinction there, intentionally.
All right. Any other questions for Ms. Travis? All right. Thank you, Ms. Travis. All right. Mr. Scandalakis or anybody from PAC, if you'd like to come forward, please.
Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee, and with all due respect to Chairman Setzler, we disagree, and we think the self-employed is important in this statute. And the reason for this is the broadness of this statute to cover not only school systems, which really is when you're applying it the most time, is when you have students having sex with someone employed in the school system. But it's also, this statute also covers psychotherapists, counselors, and other people who may have access. So that's why you're talking about self-employed. Agent, as it's defined here, says authorized to act on behalf of another. That's why we want to include the self-employed part of this.
Okay, well, I'm looking at the psychotherapy paragraph, which is, or sublet 6, which is lines 107, 108. And self-employed is not used in that language.
I'm sorry, what?
Because we restructured the sentence, not needed.
Mr. Travis says the sentence was restructured,
Okay.
so it's not needed.
All right. I'll call on Chairman Setzler.
To the gentleman, how can somebody that is a self-employed counselor in a counseling setting, how can they not be an agent of that counseling organization?
An agent of that counseling session.
So that there's a counseling center to which the person's been referred. They have 5 counselors that work for them. So the person checks in for counseling, whether it's mental health counseling or whatever
Well, when I look at the definition
Well, the
of
witness
agent,
has been, and to the gentleman, my question is, there is no self-employed language in the counseling paragraph here. So I'm not sure I understand the point of the line of questioning or the earlier testimony.
I guess I was just following up on the reference to counseling setting.
So what I guess what I'm saying is, if we could, it seems there's agreement with respect to the counselors, because self-employed is not used in lines 107, 108.
My question, Mr. Chairman, is if someone is a 1099 employee or they're a W-2 employee, they're operating a business, it's invisible to the person that comes in as a consumer of that service. This is suggesting that there's a distinction, that we need to put self-employed in there, because a 1099 person working in this probation office, working for the school, working wherever, that a 1099 employee wouldn't be covered under the definition of agent. I think that's just...
Testimony a moment ago from PAC and from Gactel was that because of the way the sentence is structured, it's not necessary.
My question is, why is it necessary anywhere?
Okay, I understand, but if it's all right, then maybe we can talk about where it does appear, not where it doesn't appear, as to whether it's necessary.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, enrolled in a school, employee or agent. How is a 1099 employee different than a W-2 employee if we have employee or agent? Agent is intended to cover, it's there for purpose of 1099 employees and to cover volunteers who've been designated and authorized with authority. That's the reason agent exists in this definition.
I would just ask you, Mr. Setzler, respectfully, if you just want to direct your questions to the witness who maybe disagrees with your position, the witness can answer your questions and the committee can hear the testimony.
And I missed the question, I'm sorry.
Okay. School setting. The chairman asked us to kind of go through these piece by piece. School setting. Employee of a school, W-2 employee of a school system or a private school, or an agent. Agent was selected specifically to cover a 1099 employee, self-employed, or a volunteer that's operating in an agency role, even though they're not employed or being compensated. They've been authorized and given authority. I think, and we've agreed on that for some time. How is self-employed not already covered under an agent? Because the W-2, the 1099 employee is a self-employed person.
Well, I think under your situation it would be, but there may be instances where the self-employed person is instructing a student and would come under the authority, but we would still want that covered.
But they're operating in an agency role. The purpose of agent is someone that's been designated. Okay, you instruct our kids. You're doing abstinence only education, so the teacher gets to check out. The outside contractor comes in to do their abstinence only block of instruction, every Friday or something. That's they're operating in an agency capacity in the school. That's the reason agency's here.
I wouldn't disagree with that scenario. I wouldn't, but I don't think that's what we were trying to cover. Home schools,
Okay.
Something of that nature.
Okay, so in a homeschool setting,
That would be more of a self-employment.
I get that, but again, respectfully, the gentleman, you have a person that is a contractor and begin, if it's under the definition of elementary and secondary education, it's furtherance of their mandatory attendance requirements. They're operating an agency role under the umbrella of the homeschooling organization they're working for.
I guess I'm thinking of agency in a different term than that, though.
All right. I think all the committee members understand the here and the line of questions. Well, what I'd like to do is maybe hear from some other members of the committee if there are any other members that have questions. Yeah, Representative Gravely.
And forgive me for that outburst,
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman. I could read Hebrew better than I can understand this argument. I'm trying to figure out what side. What do you want? What's the discrepancy here?
My concern is that the definition of agent covers any
Yeah, that's my asking.
covers any self-employed person that we would want to cover under this is under the definition of agent, and we could be very specific on these. I've got an exact example, a personal example we can speak to.
And the counselors are saying that that's not in there or already covered by the current language.
I think what the witnesses are saying that or self-employed is needed under certain paragraphs here to capture circumstances where the defendant had the sexual contact but owns the entity
And
that the victim was receiving treatment from or was under the custody of.
And I've not heard a circumstance yet in which it's not covered under agent.
And to quote Chairman Setchler, who said this many times before at hearings, words have meanings. And when you look at agent means an individual authorized to act on behalf of another. Authorized to act on behalf of another. If we don't have that self-employment part of that, that is, how do you prove on behalf of who? On behalf of another. Who's the other individual we're acting on behalf of?
This gets back to the heart of the question, Mr. Chairman. I think this bill initially did not have a definition of agent, because I believe agency is something that's fleshed out in case law and can be established. I'm perfectly fine to have no definition of it. I followed the will of some of the committee to define it, and I think if we're going to do that, I think we work on the definition of agency, not tack on or self-employed. I think self-employed opens a whole nother universe of individuals that could be caught up in this, as opposed to going to the heart of this and either addressing it in agency or leave the agency undefined so that the courts can flesh that out.
Or removing or self-employed. That would be maybe a third option. Is that right?
I think the or self-employed adds a whole set of.
No. My question is: you said you can remove agency. That's something that would satisfy the objective here. You could change the definition of agency, or the third option would be remove or self-employed where it appears. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. I think employee, agent, or self-employed. The self-employed addition is problematic. I think if we wanted to work on the definition of agency, then it's solved there.
All right. Let's hear from Representative Silcox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate Chairman Setchler bringing this bill, and I think that the subject matter is important enough that we shouldn't argue about this and we should include it.
Representative Gravely.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is the discrepancy, do you think that the language adding it or having it is too far of a reach? Or are you saying that it's not a far enough reach? Where's the...
It is a... Let me choose my words carefully here. It's a... I don't want to use loaded language here. I think it is a hasty and unnecessary ad that it's a hasty and unnecessary ad. Any circumstance you can bring that where a self-employed person is relevant to the common understanding we have of what this committee has, what this bill is doing, is already covered under the definition of agent. And if there's any uncertainty, then clarifying the definition of agent is the mechanism to do that, not by another tack on.
And if I may, Mr. Chairman, so do you feel that that language, that tack on, if you, just to,
Sure.
may affect people you're not intending to affect in this legislation?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Representative Silcox.
I appreciate what the chairman is saying, but in all sincerity, I agree with Mr. Skandalakis, because I know of situations where kids are taken to counseling and they are employed by a separate employer, and normally agency traditionally is used. It's associated with who is your employer. And if we are dealing with someone who is a counselor, for example, who's employed by a counseling center, they are not employed by the school, but they are used adjunctly to supplement the school's counseling services, then that agency would be in question. And I wouldn't want this to go to court over that. I would rather this person be included in the definition because they're self-employed with the counseling center.
Okay, if the members could suspend, I just want to kind of set the table here for just a minute. Here's where I see it in the bill. It's under circumstances where there is a school, that's under 1, self-employed appears. 2, probation, parole, accountability court, or pretrial diversion supervision. And then a sensitive care facility, which is in the definition of that would be an assisted care facility or maybe even a home health care type circumstance. All right, so those are the only areas that we're talking about right now. School, probation, or some sort of supervision through a court, and home health care or potentially elder care facility. All right, so as far as other criteria, we're not, that's not, it appears there's agreement. Let me put it that way. The prosecutors are not asking to include it in other parts. They're only asking for these 3 parts. And the sponsor is in agreement that it shouldn't be included in the other parts. So we just kind of narrowed the issues. So there might be a dispute as to school. We've heard about that. Courts, maybe you're open to discussion. If I could ask a question of the sponsor, what about the words or self-employed in circumstances of home health care where it might be owned, or there might be a facility, senior care facility, owned by a specific person? Representative Sutz.
Mr. Chairman, I think it can be solved by adding, let me answer your question indirectly, Mr. Chairman. I think it can be solved by adding on line 23 to the definition of agent, with or without compensation, or self-employed. I'm intending to have self-employed people covered under the definition of agency, and it applies throughout the bill. I'm fine to broaden the definition of agency. I just think tacking something on in these multiple parts of the bill is the problem. I have no issue broadening agency to make sure it's all good, because we're trying to accomplish the same thing. I just think it being tacked on to the end creates chaos. Creates uncertainty about what you mean by it.
Thank you. Let's give Mr. Skandalakis a minute to talk, and then he can report back if adding or self-employed in the definition of agent is acceptable to them. Thank you.
Well, now we're in a disagreement because the prosecutors say that's acceptable to us, and Ms. Travis says no, it makes it too broad. And the way we had come up structured it was we wanted it limited to those certain areas. So if you'd like to hear from Ms. Travis.
Well, we're just going to take one witness at a time right now. So any questions for Mr. Skandalakis? All right, thank you, sir.
And we are concerned about those home health care and that part too.
Yes, sir. All right, thank you. Okay. All right. Before we hear back from Ms. Travis, are there any other witnesses who'd like to speak on House Bill 43 with a substitute today? Yes, ma'am. If you just introduce yourself, please.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Melanie McNeil, I'm the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and I haven't actually seen the substitute, but the language about self-employed for those who are in long-term care is important because, for example, people who live in personal care homes might hire a proxy caregiver. That would be someone who's self-employed, but the person who's receiving the care is very vulnerable, and they're in a building with very vulnerable people. So if you're trying not to make it too broad, I would ask that you include that part when it comes to long-term care facilities.
Well, thank you, and we'll get you a copy of the draft right now, but it sounds like under either of these versions or self-employed will be included, because it would either be under, I'm not going to speak to the specifics of the language here, and there are attorneys in the room who can maybe debate exactly what it means, but just sounds like broadly, or self-employed will either be included under the definition of agent, which would apply, or as a specific add-on in the home health care, what we call a sensitive care facility here in this bill.
The reason I make the distinction
Yes,
is
ma'am.
that proxy caregiver isn't acting as an agent for anyone. They're directly hired by the family or by that resident. The same for specific care. You know, they might get specific care from someone who's self-employed. They're not acting on behalf of the personal care home. In fact, they can't. The personal care home is prohibited from hiring these folks on behalf of the residents. And so if you put it under agent, I don't think you would capture those folks.
I see. Okay.
So,
Thank you.
thank you.
All right. I didn't see any other witnesses, so Ms. Travis, if you'd like to come back up and maybe address the new potential amendment that's being discussed.
I don't think that the addition of the words "or self-employed" should go in the definition of agency, or agent rather, because then every time you use it, it is applicable. And we were trying to narrowly tailor it to the situations where it could come into play. And so you're expanding it by adding it at the end of the definition. And it also, I'm not sure, means an individual authorized to act on behalf of another with or without compensation or self-employed. You still have the precursor of they're authorized to act on behalf of another person. So I don't think that I think the home health care is the easiest one. I can't tell you enough about the court situations where there's self-employed people, but I think like in drug accountability courts, there could be an individual provider that works for himself that's providing services.
I think what we're talking about potentially would be private probation with an owner of private probation. That's what comes to my mind, possibly.
So
okay,
that's why we drew it the way we collaborated in the language.
Well, thank you for that. If you wouldn't mind holding tight just to see if we have any questions. Are there any questions for Ms. Travis? Representative Setzler?
I don't think so. I think to her point, the authorized outcome on behalf of another, that qualifier is the calculated intention of this. You have with compensation, without compensation, or status of self-employment, modified by the authority. The authority is the constricting thing. It would operate exactly as intended, and I don't have an issue with it being in a section or two. It wasn't in this substitute. Okay. Because it's any circumstance for a W-2 employee and a 1099 employee or a contractor can be interchangeable. I am fine with it being covered under agent.
Okay, understood. So you don't have a question for Ms. Travis. Do any of the committee members have a question for Ms. Travis? All right, thank you very much, Ms. Travis, again. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Okay. Are there any other questions at this point before we consider the next steps with this bill? All right. Any other? Yes, Representative Kendrick, and maybe questions for the sponsor will be appropriate at this time. Yeah. Representative Kendrick. All right, so understanding that there might be some discussion about amendments, I'm now prepared to hear a motion on this bill, if there is one. All right, there's a motion to pass on HB 43, Committee Substitute LC 289317 ERS. Is there a second? There's a motion and a second. All right. Are there any amendments? Chairman Setzler.
I'd like to, because I am fine with self-employment applying in every section here. I have no issue with that whatsoever. I just think it needs to fall under the modifier applying to agent authorized to act on behalf of. And if I'm missing something, I'm certainly open to a further amendment to the definition of agent, but the purpose all along was agency was a broad definition, but required there be an actual authorization of authority. What I'd like to offer, subject to the pleasure of the committee, Mr. Chairman, is on the end of line 23, with or without compensation, and then adding, or status of being self-employed, or self-employed. I'm open to how we might say that best.
All right, just to explain maybe the concept here, it would be comma or self-employed inserted before the period on line 23, and then what about where or you would want those removed?
And then the locations identified by the committee on lines 59, 65, 92, 100, and 110, the or self-employed would be stricken, and instead remove a comma and insert between employee and agent, employee or agent, period.
Okay, I think everyone understands the concept of what you're outlining here, the proposed amendment. All right, is there a second for the Setzler amendment? All right, there's a motion and second for the Setzler amendment. So at this point in time, we will open it up for discussion of the Setzler amendment. Is there any discussion? All right, I don't see any discussion. So
what I don't want to do is I don't want to there be uncertainty about what this does or where different groups are. I'd be interested to hear what Ms. Travis spoke. I'd love to hear what the Prosecuting Attorney's Council thought about that definition in terms of furthering what they're trying to accomplish. If I could.
I think they're opposed to, well, then why don't you come on up to the microphone, please. Forgive me, I'm sorry. I think their testimony was they supported it and Gachtel opposed it. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, if you just confirm if that's right.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
All right, thank you. I apologize. Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, I don't know if they have any thoughts or anyone has thoughts about, from a scrivener's perspective, with or without compensation or status of being self-employed or self-employed. I think the courts can get it right. I'm open to ideal wording.
All right, Mr. Smith, any objection to or self-employed from PAC?
Or a self-employed individual, please.
Now, I'm fine to throw it more broadly than self-employed. If they're a contractor that's not self-employed, they're a W-2 employee of another entity that's working in another place in an agency responsibility. I don't want to make it just, I mean.
So Representative Setzler, do you wish to change your amendment, yes or no, to or a self-employed individual?
Mr. Chairman, I'm fine with that. I think I'm not concerned. I want to make sure that people who are there on a contract basis with an agency responsibility can be subject to this. My wife was a counselor in a school, had one-on-one contact with kids.
Well, let's ask, is that going to be covered? Prosecutors, do we expect? Prosecutors are nodding yes. Gachtel, do you have any input on that, Ms. Travis? No.
Mr. Chairman.
No input. And I assume you remain opposed to the amendment.
I understand what y'all are doing and
I understand. So you, gotcha. All right.
Mr.
So, okay. So really, it's to you, Mr. Setzler. Do you want that to be your amendment or not?
I don't want to make a 10-year decision in 30 seconds when it can take 2 minutes to do it. That's my request to the chairman. I don't want to hastily say self-employment if that, again, in the circumstance, we have community service boards that employ counselors. They put in a school setting, they have an office in the school, and they're one-on-one contact in a counseling setting with kids. They're not self-employed. They're a W-2 employee of a community service board in schools, one-on-one contact with kids. My wife did that before we had kids. She was an agent of the school and should be caught up in this. She was not self-employed. She was a W-2 employee of another entity. So before we say self-employed, I want to make sure a contract employee or a contract or in a contract, I'd like to broaden it even more to make sure we're not outsmarting ourselves. That's a specific, real circumstance.
Okay, so as I understand what you're saying, again, I appreciate any direction you can give, and if you need a minute or two to think about it, that's fine. We can take some time, but as I understand what you're saying, then is you would prefer or self-employed because it's more broad.
With or without compensation, or contract of service or something, or service contract.
Okay, so
It's broader than self-employment.
or service contract.
Or contract of service.
Okay, why don't you take a minute and write down what your proposed amendment is? All right, Representative Montahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick comment. Just wanted to see if, and I don't even know who to pose this question to, but would it be the Prosecuting Attorney's Council?
But Mr. Smith, Representative has a question. If you'd please come to the podium.
The question being, there's going to be some changes made to the Georgia Apex program, which is as far as I understand, the counseling and the mental health of the children across the state of Georgia. There's going to be a pretty large investment. How is this going to affect that program, and can you give us some insight to it?
My name is Robert Smith. I'm General Counsel to the Prosecuting Attorney's Council. Representative, to your question about the Apex Commission or the Apex recommendations, I would be uncomfortable speculating since that hasn't happened yet, and also the fact that I'm not fully knowledgeable to be able to give an explanation as to what will happen. I can speak to what this bill will do, is that if there's someone who has an agency relationship as defined by this code section, or is an employee of a school system that engages in an inappropriate relationship with a student at that school who's over the age of 16 or 17, or over the age of 16, they could be prosecuted under this statute.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know how to ask this question. Excuse my ignorance, but if they're working for a state agency, would they be under the agency of the local school board, or how would they be considered? I just want to make sure that.
Maybe Mr. Smith can answer the prosecutors would have to, I suppose, prove the element under this circumstance. Yes, sir.
Basically, if you had someone that the school system, if there was a state agency that said, okay, this is a counselor or this is a person to go into the school, the question then we would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the actor or the counselor or whoever was sent in by the school was either an individual authorized to act on behalf of the school system with or without the fact they were being compensated, or based on whatever Chairman Setzler's amendment says, that we would have to prove that relationship beyond a reasonable doubt that they did that. Or we would have to allege that they were an employee and say that they worked for the school system.
So this would still allow us to protect the children. I mean, that's what I'm getting. I just want to make sure that there's not a loophole here when we go to expand a program for mental health for children that we're missing here as we make this legislation.
Representative, I can say that having been here for 3 years and watched the effort that Chairman Setzler's put into this bill, the passion in which he speaks when he speaks about this bill and everyone else in this committee and the subcommittee, that their intent has always been to protect children, and that is our intent as well. And we believe this is a bill that would help us. to
Very
do
well.
that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so I will now recognize Chairman Setzler to, only for the purpose of stating the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, the amendment would read on the line, end of line 23, compensation or under contract, period. And strike the self-employed references alluded to earlier, Mr. Chairman.
All right, so the amendment, I'll restate the amendment. And fair to say you'll withdraw your previous amendment. All right, so we'll need a second for this one. All right, that after the word compensation on line 23, it would then read or under contract, and then remove or self-employed from lines 58, 65, 92, 97, 98, 100, and 110, and put or between employee and agent on the preceding verbiage. And of course, address the grammatical issues. Is that your amendment?
It is my amendment, Mr. Chairman, and I don't know if he would entertain any feedback on that. I want to make.
Let's see if there's a second. Is there a second? All right, there's a second. A second. Any need for discussion? All right, hearing none, then I'll accept. We'll vote on the amendment. All those in favor of the Setzler amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the amendment passes unanimously. So now we're back to HB 43. All right, there's a motion and a second. Any further discussion or amendments? All right, hearing none, all those in favor of the substitute as has been amended here today with the Setzler amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, it's on to rules. Thank you. We are adjourned.